Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Taksashila's postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy. My name is Adya, and today I'm going to be in conversation with my colleague Anushka. She's a researcher with the Geostrategy program here at Takshashila and has done some really interesting work on the Shahid and the use of air power in West Asia, as well as on the supply chain of the Shahid. So we're going to be getting into that a bit. And yeah, let's jump right into it. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me, Adya.
So before we get down to the Shahid and the nitty-gritty of that, I just want to start off by asking you how the US and Iran have used their air power over the course of the war in West Asia, especially since, much of it was fought using aerial strikes. So I want to ask you how they used it and also whether anything about this war has changed how we view air superiority.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I think air and missile power is something observers around the world have been keenly looking at, not just in the course of the month and a half long West Asia war, but also the Ukraine war and Russia's tactics before that, and then maybe even going as far back as to 2021, when in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, there was a use of drones as well. So the conversation on the relevance and validity of fighter jets, of missiles, and of drones, of course, is increasingly out there for learners and observers to look at. Of course, the West Asia war has demonstrated a tad more interesting sets of conclusions and insights on the use of air and missile power, and not just from the perspective of the clearly superior powers in play, which is the US and Israel, but also from Iran's perspective. And like you said, we'll get into Iran's drone and missile strategy a bit later. But just on how the US and Israel deploy their air power and what the mission profile for their air forces was like. Now, it's interesting to note, of course, that for them, that was the most important and massively deployed instrument. If I remember correctly, in the first few days of the war, starting February 28, there were as many as 900 strikes using fighter jet attacks and missiles across Iran. And so that's a lot of targets decimated, right? And of course, with missiles in particular, the strategy was also something that observers are now terming salvo decapitation, which essentially means that you use a missile salvo or a bunch of precision guided missiles to essentially take out the top leadership of any country's military ecosystem, right? So this salvo decapitation tactic was essentially used to take out the leadership of the IRGC, the National Security Council or the Supreme National Council of Iran, and of course other entities, the IRGC, Navy and ground forces alike, so on and so forth. So that was one, I think, significant component of how US and Israel used air and missile power. The other thing pertains to the tactics of SEAD and DIAD, or however you'd want to call it, which essentially means suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses, right? So as part of those strategies, the goal was essentially to take over as much as 80 to 85% of Iran's available airspace for military operations. And then, once that goal is achieved and you've suppressed enemy air defenses and aerial availability for military conflict, especially at much higher altitudes or the altitudes at which fighter jets operate, then essentially your work boils down to just making sure that the replacement parts are in place, there is mid-air refueling, your bases hold steady in case there has to be replenishment on the ground, and then of course you have to make sure that your troops are ready to rumble and scramble whenever necessary. So that overwhelming suppression was something that the Israelis and the Americans were able to use. And of course, a consequence of that, which was one of the mission outcomes for US Central Command or CENTCOM, was the destruction of Iranian missile capabilities. And so, again, if reported numbers or widely held as legitimate numbers are to be believed, as many as 85% to 90% of Iran's launchers and interceptors have essentially been decimated. And then there were some other numbers from Alma Press and the likes, which talked about how Iran's launch of drones has also gone down by 80%, which I don't think this was Alma Press. I think this was Admiral Cooper of US CENTCOM who had said this. And you can see the numbers declining in strikes, right? Because Iran has used maybe 2,500 drones for its strikes across West Asia during the course of the war. And the numbers went down from hundreds in the first few days to less than 100, sometimes less than 50 in the succeeding attrition campaigns. So that's basically the few takeaways that I had from the US and Israeli air campaigns. Of course, a lot of these were supplemented by multi-million-dollar interceptors in Israel's David Sling, Iron Dome, and the likes. The Arrow as well, of course. And then if we come to Iran's tactics, I think because of all the international embargoes that have been implemented on Iran pursuant to the knowledge of its nuclear weapon program, it was never actually capable of building a turnkey fighter jet in and of itself. And no country was ever going to sell one to it directly, right? So, and we should not believe that traditional air power has gone away altogether. Like, you still see the F-22 Raptors and the F-35 Lightnings, all of them being a critical component of the arsenals of those on the opposite end to Iran, right? So for that kind of a conflict with a fighter jet where you're looking at the enemy 50 to maybe 150 kilometers away, and the engagement window is going to be narrow because you're constantly exposed, it's good to have fighter jets in your arsenal. But Iran didn't. So its strategy revolved around the use of drones and missiles. Now, for missiles in and of itself, I think it was able to achieve fairly decent results. It was able to target the Dubai International Airport, the airport in Qatar, a refueling facility in Bahrain, the Manama facility of the Fifth Fleet of the US. Then it was successfully able to target a Bapco refinery in Bahrain, and then that refinery had to declare force majeure. But many of these attacks weren't just missiles. They were also drones. And the Shahids in particular, and their various variants, as it were, the 131, the 136, the 107, these were used critically, and these are, fire and forget drones. So these were used critically to realize Iran's airstrike goals. And of course, they're an interesting story, which we can get into. Just one final point about something else that was also notable in the US and Israel's air power campaign. And one of the mission components was the targeting of naval vessels. So again, it is likely that the Israeli Defense Forces or the IDF was able to target as many as 50 to 100 Iranian vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. And what that does is also enables the US and Israeli side to make the case that Iran's leverage in the Strait of Hormuz isn't permanent. But of course, that is debatable. And you can also argue the other side, where Iran was strictly and firmly able to enforce some kind of a fait accompli in the Strait of Hormuz and still get the US to kind of talk about negotiations and talk about opening the Hormuz, albeit the words used to get Iran to open the Hormuz weren't the politest, but that's what war is.
It's interesting, like what you said with decimating Iran's naval forces. what Iran has been forced to do there also has been quite similar to having to rely on drones. They've had to rely on Ghadir class subs and fast attack craft because that's what they have and that's what the IRGC Navy use. Now, before we get into the meat of this conversation, which I'm dying to get to, which is the Shahid, I want to ask why you think the drone has become front and center to modern warfare and how has the use of drones changed? And also, the ability of drones to loiter and navigate using pre-programmed coordinates and all of that. How does that change the calculus of beyond visual range in combat?
Right. Yeah,
I know it's a lot that I've thrown at you.
No, actually, I guess that is the tactical and the operational questions that any military will be asking around the world when they think of why drones, right? So I think there are a few interesting points of note here. One, on the broader question of why a drone has become so prominent in modern warfare, I mean, it is simply because of the capability it has been able to demonstrate despite being uncrewed and even in a situation where a human can simply fire it and forget it. And if the goal, for example, is to use a $400 first person view weapon system to essentially destabilize or disable a $4 million tank, then why scramble a fighter jet every now and then, right? Or why use a missile salvo all the time? Those come with higher costs, higher need for precision, the need to deploy crew, and of course to do a post-kill assessment of where the strategy went wrong. But with drones, because of the cost advantage and because crew is not being exposed to really high risk operations, and with better drones, the distance that the strike capability can take, again without scrambling a jet or without scrambling a salvo, is these are advantages that only something as unique as a drone or an unmanned aerial vehicle can provide. Of course, as you alluded to, for the IRGC Navy, they also used unmanned boat bombs or boat drones, which exploded near another vessel. So it's not just unmanned aerial vehicles; it's also unmanned naval vehicles or surface vehicles that essentially get the job done without a lot of risk exposure. So the cost combined with the risk exposure combined with the ability to democratize, to make precision warfare accessible, all of these are factors that I think have really given drones a push. And I think the final frontier for something like this would be complete AI enabled autonomous capability. For a swarm of drones, a set of drones that are interconnected with with a single battle link, to be able to take on a mighty target like a tank or a fighter jet and defeat them in bulk, right? So I don't think we're exactly there yet, but I think we have really meaningful outcomes out of drones. And a lot of it also has to do with operational validation and testing, right? You see that Ukraine has been able to prove that it can get the enemy to tremble at the idea of drones, right? So they'll, I don't know, import a cardboard drone or a carbon fiber drone from Australia or make it in-house themselves. I mean, at one point they were producing, 2 million drones, FPV drones in 2024. So the production scale is massive. And they were essentially then using it in attritional and sustained campaigns against the Russians, which and at this point, I think the number is a little something like this, right? More targets on either side have been lost to drone attacks than they have been to artillery. So the operational environment is also such that drones are becoming more prominent in warfare. Now, to the question of traditional BVR and how loitering capability and pre-programming make a difference. I think this is where things can get a little technical, but I'll do my best to to give some simple explanations. At least that's how I understand them as well, which is very simply, right? So drones come with something called a GNSS module. Now, a GNSS module is a power-packed GPS, self-reliant GPS in and of itself. What that essentially means is that it will have its own radar, its own antenna, and it will be hard coded with what we know as waypoints. Waypoints are essentially points on a map. They are latitude and longitude. So you can tell the GNSS module or GPS module aboard a drone that, look, there is point A, point B, point C, and point D. You need to fly from point A on your own, reach point B, avoid the mountain, avoid the river, but fly very close to it. Go to point C, do your attack, and come back to point D. Or sometimes you don't even have to come back if it's an FPV or a fire and forget drone. And this waypoint navigation, when fed into the GNSS module, enables the drone to autonomously or fly in an autopiloted manner. Autonomy is different than autopiloting, of course. So I think that's an interesting kind of variance that the audiences should also always keep in mind. But once it is autopiloted that way, maybe the operator has to fly it to a certain distance, or the operator has to enable it to take off, which is where the Iranians use the rocket assisted takeoff, where small pulse rocket boosters basically give the drone altitude and cruise speed. And that's after that, the GNSS module does the work. In addition, the drones are hardwired today with something known as brushless motors. Now, motors are something that use power to generate movement. And at one point, when there were motors that used carbon brushes, those brushes would, in the process of generating electricity and creating movement, catch fire, they would spark, and they wouldn't have as much energy to produce over long periods of time. Today, with the introduction of brushless motors, drones can loiter and sustain movement for much longer, for half a day, for a full day, than they could before. So the loitering capability, in a first person view, it can come from a remote operator, pardon me. But in longer endurance drones, it can come from brushless motors. It can come from the ability to navigate on its own. And even one of the waypoint hard coding pertains to how, if you can't strike or if you can't complete your mission, you come back to where you flew. So all of these are programming kind of models that are making drones, or making pre-programming and loitering capabilities in drones more interesting. Of course, how this is different and why it is better than traditional BVR in some ways is because of the radar signature. Now, if you're using a fighter jet, it will have a bigger radar cross section. It will use much more metallic components in a cheaper drone. And it will also have the jet fumes that will have their own infrared signature. Now, most drones have none of that. So they are less detectable for them once they begin to loiter, and once many of them can't be detected altogether by interceptors, they can approach their target more easily. The engagement window expands, and it's not as narrow as a dogfight between fighter jets. And a lot of that is enabled by RCS and the body profile, or the airframe and its components. So all of these modifications or variations in drones enable it to perform better, or have a much more riskier and more effective mission profile than fighter jets or traditional precision guided missiles in certain campaigns.
Okay, thank you. Before we talk about the Shahid's production ecosystem, for a second, I wanted to ask you about how the Shahid compares to the idea of a global high performance drone, how it compares, how its performance has been, and given how Iran has deployed it, whether it has proven in a sense that you don't necessarily need to have a high performance drone to fulfill all the objectives that you would want it for.
Right, that is true. And I'll keep my answer to this very short. I think the philosophy with Shahids, now I haven't been part of any Iranian backroom conversations, but I think the philosophy that they have been going for is to produce a good enough drone that can achieve 80% of its mission targets, because and this is the kind of frugal strategy that you need to deploy in a situation, or jugaad strategy for us much too familiar with the Indian ecosystem. You need to deploy because you are embargoed for years and years, right? So I think if you look at contemporaries, or some of the best performing drones in the world today, In terms of the more expensive ones, $1 million and above, you have the Predator and the MQ-9B. Now, those you're looking at mini fighter jets, right? Except they're uncrewed. They have the ability to fly at high altitudes at great speeds and with a lot of endurance over hours, right? They're the best make and model. They have payload capacities that are massive, well above 200 or 300 kgs, if I'm not wrong. And so drones that every country would want in bulk, and you'd want to use them all the time, but you can't because they're expensive. And when you lose them, it really hurts. Just like it would also hurt if you lose an F-16, even though there are F-35s in the market, right? Because this was what you could afford. You could only afford 10 of them, say if you are Saudi or the UAE, maybe even lesser. And if you lose them, it hurts. So though Male or Hale or medium altitude or high altitude long endurance drones are limited in numbers, but they have a more expansive mission profile. Then if you look at drones at the first person view or the fire and forget level, you have the Shahids very much so in contention with other drones like the Russian Lancet, the Zala Lancet, which again costs around the same, which is between $20,000 to $40,000. And of course, can carry a payload of up to 50 to 100 kgs and produce meaningful outcomes against tanks, against personnel, against a group of troops, and potentially even against interceptors and fighter jets. So that's there. And then you have the tube launched drones. And I think the US operates one which costs about, I don't know, $400, which is really cheap, as cheap as you can go with a drone, right? I think it's called the Switchblade drone, and it's tube fired, so it doesn't even have a big launch platform like the Shahid has a truck, right? So it can be carried in a backpack. And then you have the Ukrainian Black Hornet, which is 195,000, and that just fits on the palm of your hand. It's 7 or 8 centimeters or something of the sort. So the variety of drones that you can play around with and achieve meaningful outcomes with is expansive. But what the Iranians have been able to demonstrate in West Asia is that they can sustain an air operation just using some missiles, and after the missiles are lost, Shahids. So I think that's what the key takeaway here is. And so it essentially tells a country that you can reverse engineer, beg, borrow, steal, reproduce, establish another production facility in Russia, export it to as many countries as you can to create operational testing environments, and then eventually carry out pretty successful campaigns using it, even if you don't have a fighter jet. And that's what I think is the value lesson here, that not everyone needs an MQ-9B or a Poseidon, right? Yeah, thanks.
The sense one got when the US launched Operation Epic Fury was that they seemed to believe that Iran would not have the capacity to retaliate. They said, we've destroyed Iran's entire missile program, whatever. And I think that's when they expected that they would not be able to carry out any significant campaign, which they did using the Shahid. So I want to understand from you how that happened, how that production ecosystem functioned given the fact that the sanctions were so intense, especially since I understand that a lot of components are sourced from Western dual-use markets.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the most interesting bit of how the Shahid works, or how its production lines and supply cycle works. So I think there are 3 or 4 primary pathways as to how that have led to the Shahid coming about. One is that we have to look at where some of this starts, right? Iran has been thinking about the value proposition of drones since 2011, when during a skirmish with the US, an RQ-11 Sentinel drone of the Americans landed in Iran. They picked it up, they reverse engineered it, and they made sure that they wanted something like this for themselves. Maybe a year or 2 years later, they caught a Boeing Scan Eagle, which is an ISR come attack drone, more ISR than attack, and they were able to reverse engineer it as well. So it was catching those drones from the US that made them see the value proposition in this kind of modular weapon system. And then eventually there were different ways to go about it, right? One was you needed the components for it. You needed a production facility domestically and then maybe one abroad. You needed consumers to test their effectiveness out, and you needed a financing and R&D ecosystem. So let's start with the latter first. In terms of the R&D and the financing ecosystem, I think the key pushes have been from the IRGC. And the IRGC funds banks, private sector firms, and other entities as part of this financial arm that they have called Bunyad Tawon Sipah. And that channels in money for defense production. It gets private sector firms to reverse engineer components, to learn from global industry, and to, of course, produce domestic R&D for the Mohair drones and then the Shahed drones today. Then there is HESA or Shahid Aviation Industries, which are the defense SOEs of Iran. They collaborate with private sector firms like Mado Company or Mado, which has a longer name, but I'm not going to get into that. And they help with engine reverse engineering in particular, and then the entire production cycle and R&D as well. So the financing and the production and R&D are handled between SOEs, IRGC, and companies like Mado, and then there are banks as well, right? Then, if you look at the components that go into the Shahed, where do they come from? You mentioned that a lot of them they have come in from Western market, right? And a lot of what we know about these has come from teardowns that the US and Kiev have done, because a lot of Russian warfighting is happening using Shaheds. So Russia is in fact one of the countries that imports a bunch of Shaheds from Iran. And so they also act like an operational environment for the Iranians, right? So the teardowns that Kiev intelligence or American intelligence has done, and they didn't just pick them up from the Ukrainian battlefield, they also picked them up from these attacks that Iran launched on the Saudis and the Iraqis in 2019 and 2020, I think. So what they're learning is that all the microprocessors, the servo motors, the memory drives, the flash memory, all of those components are coming in from the US. And how they are likely coming in is, and the US Treasury Department has done a lot of work on this as part of their transnational Iran UAV and missile targeting program. What they have done is they have unveiled cases of how they found that shell companies in Hong Kong, in Bahrain, even in Belgium, and of course in China, were essentially using the names of legitimate procurement companies, misspelling names in email IDs, procuring them from American companies, and rerouting them through China to sell them to Iran. Another thing they would find is that Chinese reproduction hubs or reselling hubs would purchase them off of eBay for like German Infineon transistors. They are available on eBay for like $20. They would buy them and they would re-export them to Iran. And then there's this third interesting pathway which the Australians discovered, which is that the Chinese would sell something from Australia to Iran or from Australia to someplace else to Iran, probably Turkey, because Turkey also purchases a lot of American components and probably resells them to Iran. So the Australians discovered that the Chinese would call antennas for the Shaheds agricultural parts or agricultural equipment. And they would be labeled so both in English and Chinese, and no one would be bothered to look inside. And they would reach the Iranians, and then Ukrainians will find that this is how they were labeled, right? So all of these diverse pathways and this Jugaad strategy has come together for the Shahed to be made today. And lo and behold, like it has a light body, it has a honeycomb infrastructure inside. Sometimes they viewed balsa wood for the internal material of the carbon fiber airframe. And they've been able to come up with meaningful components and or a meaningful design and meaningful variants. Just one final thing about the engine itself. In the engine in particular is where you see China's role as the least incidental. You see that there is direct transfer of technology from the Chinese. If you look at the engine of the Shahed 107, it is a Wankel rotary engine, one of the simplest types of engine that you can make. That has come in from a British engine that the AR-371, which the Chinese reverse engineered, and then they sold it to Iran, and the Iranians reverse engineered that Chinese engine. Then the Shahid 131 has a piston engine, I think the MD-550. That has come in from a German facility in Xiamen, China. In Fujian province, this German engine company called Limbach established a facility in 2012. I don't think it's so well functioning today, but Limbach would have produced an engine with the Chinese in collaboration. And that technology was transferred on to the MD-550, which the Mado company brought to Iran from China and reverse engineered it. And then there is Shahid 136, which has a jet-powered engine, and that also has Chinese footprints on it. And pardon me in advance if I'm mixing the variants here, but you can check out the paper that we've written for Takshashila on this. But essentially, in the piston engines and in the Wankel rotary engines, you have the Chinese reverse engineered version of engines coming into Iran, and then the Iranians reverse engineering it. So it's really really mind blowing to think about how they just operationalized it. And you can debate strategy later, but this is definitely interesting to kind of try and replicate at home. Yeah.
So, now that to an extent we've seen that this is the tried and tested method of having your own air campaign, and given that people now know that this works, I think even the US has tried to reverse engineer the Shahid and has their own variation of that. Are we entering a new phase of how warfare works, where anyone who has like a modest-ish budget can basically end up developing thousands of drones that I think give even some very sophisticated interceptors a run for their money?
Right. So I would be a little suspicious of that idea. As much as I'd love to joke about how you should try this at home. I think even the Shahid example has demonstrated that it takes that decade-long cycle to go from 2011, catching an American drone and reverse engineering it, to getting your own components from around the world, including the West, to actually putting it together and reaching that stage in 2026. So maybe 15 years that you can produce 400 drones a day, and you can experiment with different components. Now, the difference between a non-state actor and a state actor in some of these instances is that the latter can mobilize much more resources and can enter into diplomatic partnerships, say Iranians tryst with the Chinese and Russians, that can help them materialize something like this despite being one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. And of course, others which aren't sanctioned do this legally and at a bigger scale, right? Which is why the Indians get these massive Male and Hale drones, like the Heron drones from the Israelis. But I think that said, for non-state actors, I think there are a lot of examples today of them trying to make first-person view drones to fight internally in civil unrest or with their own governments, right? Of course, Hezbollah and Hamas and other Iraqi militias that are backed by Iran, those are different cases because there's a state sponsor, a state patron that is helping them out. And so we've seen Hezbollah use drones or missiles as much as it could have. Even manpads and small arms and light weapons that it has been able to use, right? Those have come in through state support. But if you look at Myanmar, rebel forces that are trying to fight the junta government itself, they have to do it at home. So there are examples of 3D printing facilities in the jungles of Myanmar where these, small militia groups or rebel groups, as it were, are 3D printing components. They're again getting rerouted components from Thailand or China. And then they're putting them in and learning as they go and trying to build it. So I think, as with anything else, we're still at a stage where drones require certain resources for mass production and for producing a good enough variant, as I alluded to earlier, that states are mobilizing. But I think the revolution in drone affairs has only come in from commercial successes. The reason why swarm drones or stag drones are so popular is because DJI, a Chinese company at one point in 2015, was able to captured the world's largest market in terms of commercial drones. And drones have been around for a long time. Hobbyist drones are used by the public. Civilians use them to whatever, spy on a neighbor, if I may say so, as wrong as it is, So they've been around forever, but I think for a military grade drone, you need state sources. But we are very close to where drones are being caught around the world, and even parts of civil society have the capability to look at their components and go, oh, this is something I can actually commercially buy off the shelf, including an AI developer kit. One of the Shahid's Russian variants, the MS-001, had an NVIDIA Jetson Orin developer kit, which has 67 million TOPS capacity, right? And it's available to students for $250. So if somebody is rich enough and they have $250, you can get it off the shelf and make a drone. So we're in that paradoxical position today where a lot of people can catch on to a lot of components, but building airframe required CNC machines and all of that, which are resources that states can mobilize better than others. But it soon could be that in the future, precision guidance and precision strike capability is much more democratized, including to actors in whose hands you wouldn't want to see drones. And I guess till then, it's just a wait and watch and a kind of a regulatory hurdle to think about at the global level, how to govern drone components and their sales, among other things.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I think there's much to look at when it comes to Shahid's production line, and also much to learn from how Iran has mobilized their resources and utilized drones. You should definitely check out Anushka's paper on the Shahid, because I think she barely touched the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the detail of the work she's done. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to our listeners as well.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.